Let's talk about difficulty. Video games are a weird medium in which the player's skill in the game can directly affect the experience that they have with the game. The majority of games allow you to control the difficulty by having different modes that affect different stats in the games. Even games like Devil May Cry, a game about expressing yourself through cool flashy combos that increases a literal style meter whenever you kill an enemy, has an easier version for players who just want to experience the story and see Dante and his family therapy group kick some ass. But then we have FromSoft games. From Software created inherently difficult video games such as the infamous Dark Souls series and critically acclaimed games like Bloodborne, Sekiro, and of course the world-renowned Elden Ring. From Software games are unique in the fact that they're not only intentionally difficult, but the games give you no option to make the game easier on yourself through difficulty settings. Demon's Souls even makes the game more difficult when you die, essentially punishing the player for being bad at the game. But talk to any FromSoft veteran and they'll tell you that there are ways to make the game easier or harder on yourself. Magic builds are generally considered an easier way to play through the game as you don't need to deal with the intentionally stiff combat systems as much. Despite this, the player will still have to find ways to make the game easier on their own, and will more than likely have to overcome some obstacle if they want to take an easier path. In games like this, the difficulty is more than an option in the menu that the player can select if they're having a hard time with the game. It's something the player has to learn to control as they play through the game. When the game is specifically designed around one level of difficulty, it can lead to some of the most engaging moments in any game. And it's a big reason why FromSoft games always do so well and have the hook for a lot of players. Now, let me ask you a question. Are multiplayer games supposed to be difficult? Now, this is a bit of a weird question, because a game being a multiplayer game could mean a lot of different things. For example, party games inherently are supposed to be easy. You want players to be able to pick them up as fast as possible and be able to play with purpose almost as soon as they see whatever minigame they're playing, as any amount of confusion could lead to them seeing the game as bad and not fun. But we're not talking about party games, we're talking about the other kind of multiplayer games. The kind of multiplayer games that you see your friends playing and think, yeah, you know, it's free, I might as well give it a try. Not knowing that the actual cost of admission into the game is the price of your soul. As the years have gone on, it's become more and more common for video game developers to try and develop a multiplayer game with a competitive scene in mind. The practice of people playing these games for any amount of money is referred to as esports, and if you're like me, a 22-year-old white guy who spends more time playing TF2 than he did studying for any test he ever took, you're probably pretty familiar with the concept. It's pretty common for any multiplayer game that comes out now to have some sort of ranked matchmaking or a competitive queue attached to it, and even if the game doesn't have one, if the game is good enough, members of the community will find their own ways to make competitive modes. And when there's competition, there's skilled players for people to fight. So I ask you, are these games difficult? Yeah, they are. Most competitive games are designed with the idea that they're simple on the surface, but the more you dig, the more complex they get. Counter-Strike is simply shoot the bad guy and stop them from planting the bomb, but the game has advanced mechanics which make shooting your gun a more difficult task than you'd imagine, with things like spray patterns, bullet deviation while walking, smoke setups to block off sightlines, flashbang, fake flashbangs, and not to mention you're dealing with this and more on a team with 4 other people against 5 other people who can all communicate and come up with different plans. When taking all of this at face value, it's no wonder that people look at competitive games and say, yeah, no, I'm good, and go back to one of a dozen farming simulators in order to have a nice, relaxing time. And that's not to even look at how toxic some people can be when they play these games. But there's one genre of game that I see people struggle with the most when it comes to getting into them. A genre I hold near and dear to my heart, and one that, in my humble opinion, is the most satisfying to get good at. I'm of course talking about fighting games. Because of course I am, why wouldn't I be? Fighting games are in a weird place when it comes to competitive video games. They're one of the oldest competitive genres to still be around, being mostly unchanged when it comes to how they were back in the 90s, but the communities around any fighting games are absolutely tiny when you compare them to the gigantic size of the biggest esports right now. If you ask people who are interested in competitive games why they don't play fighting games, they'll either give you a response of them saying they just don't care, which, okay, fair enough, I guess. Or there's a chance that they'll say they've been interested, but the games are a bit too hard to get into. The stigma of fighting games are hard has plagued these games for years, and it's still around to this day in some forms. I've tried to get some of my non-fighting game friends into Guilty Gear Strive, a game which some of the FGC sees as a fighting game for babies, and they either bounce off the game because they struggle too hard with it, or refuse to pick up the game in the first place because they know it'll be too hard for them. I only have one non-fighting game friend who's stuck with it to this day, with each of the friends I've asked before them having played other competitive games for years with varying degrees of success. So, why is this stigma here? What can developers do to help get rid of it? And what do people who already play these games need to do to help newcomers? Well, to figure that out, we need to know what makes competitive games hard in the first place. Now, any game can technically be competitive, but not every game is a competitive esport. But why is that? The best competitive games have a simple premise, but end up having a lot of depth when you start digging into the games. Let's talk about something like Rocket League. The idea is extremely simple. It's football, but you drive a car. Hit the ball into the net. The team with the most points at the end of the timer wins the match. Simple, right? Well, the depth comes from the way that you can hit the ball into the net, because I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the car has a jet attached to the back of it. The depth of the game comes from how you actually maneuver your car around the field. Your depth comes from being able to recognize the situation and do the correct maneuvers in order to either protect your own goal or advance your offense towards the opponent's goal. Situations like this, where physical skill is required in order to gain an advantage in a match, is generally referred to as micro. Micro interactions are everywhere in different games. For example, flicking and hitting a headshot is a micro interaction as you test your aim. Dodging abilities in a MOBA requires micro skill as you maneuver your character around the screen. Executing a drift around a corner is a micro skill. Anything that requires quick physical reactions from a player and executions of inputs is considered a micro skill or a micro situation. But what about a game without any form of execution? What if we look at a card game? Card games don't require any quick reactions or physical inputs. In fact, the game allows you to take your time between turns, with a game like Hearthstone giving you over a minute for every turn you take. However, talk to anyone who's played this game for a long time and they'll still tell you that getting to the top of the game is hard and there's interactions that you need to think about. This is because card games like this de-emphasize the micro aspects of competitive games, but focus more on macro game plans. Macro refers to the longer-term game plans that players need to enact over the course of the entire match. It's generally best to think of macro as your win condition. In a card game, macro refers to the state at which you need your deck and board to be in order to beat the opponent, alongside figuring out what your opponent's deck goal is and how to avoid their win condition, or just directly stop them.
What?
For another example, in Counter-Strike, the macro game would be how you approach the bomb site as a team in order to beat the opponent's defense. This includes what smokes you're going to throw, what angles you're going to push, who's going to push there. Will you try and make noise at a different site of the map in order to bait the enemy into moving away from your actual desired location, or will you just rush it and hope that they don't notice? Macro is generally the part of the games that take much more strategy and thought. Depending on your game, the amount that it will lean on between how much macro skill you need and how much micro skill you'll need will vary, and each game fills a niche between these two parts that fans of these games and genres like. There's one third aspect of competitive games that we need to take into account when it comes to this discussion, and that is of course the metagame. The metagame is a game that's played outside of the game. The meta is generally the strongest strategy that currently exists in the game, and is always changing as players find new micro and macro strategies within the game. In a card game, this refers to the best deck in the game, one whose macro strategy is so powerful that no other decks can beat it. And the decks that can beat it are generally played as much, because if you're going to play anything else and running to the best deck, you're kinda screwed. In a tactical shooter, this will refer to the best guns that kill the fastest, or the best smoke setups, or the best characters to play on any given map due to their inherent power. In something like a MOBA, it could be a team composition, or a one-shot combo with a character that's so good that no one can beat it. The meta is how the game evolves, and keeping an eye on it is very important if you want to get good. When you have all three of these elements combining, changing, and evolving in different ways, along with a dedicated community that plays the game regularly in a stable competitive setting, you have an esport. So, the big question is, what makes fighting games unique? Fighting games fit in a pretty interesting spot when it comes to esports. The FGC is seen as poor, like, really poor. There's no fighting game that's absolutely huge compared to the rest, and even the biggest games don't exactly have the biggest reach when it comes to comparing them to other franchises. Even Street Fighter and Tekken, two of the most recognizable fighting games around the world, are considered small fry when compared to something like, oh, I don't know, League of Legends. This has led to the fighting game community being pretty tight-knit though. It's not uncommon for people who play fighting games to actually play multiple different games instead of just sticking to one main one. But who cares about that? What makes them different from other competitive games? Well, for starters, the most popular mode of basically every fighting game is a 1 versus 1 mode. This obviously isn't wholly unique to the genre. We brought up card games earlier, for example. But it is still a noticeable factor when it comes to these games. In most competitive games, you have some form of team with you that can help you succeed. Or if you're on your own, you're probably fighting a bunch of different people and not one other person. The one-on-one aspect of fighting games makes the conflicts you face personal, and lets each player express themselves fully through their own character. When you watch good players play, you can see little flares of how they play differently, and if you pay enough attention, you might even see little hints of other players' strategies and techniques that they picked up from reviewing other players' matches or just training with them. Despite it being a solo game, the community for these games are extremely important. And talking about fighting games without talking about the FGC is very hard, which is why I've already failed the task. The controls for the games are also pretty different to basically every other game genre. The majority of games are 2D, with forward and back controlling movement and up controlling jump, kind of like a platformer. But basic defensive mechanics such as blocking are generally tied to holding back on the controller. Not to mention you have different buttons that all do attacks and motion inputs, which just complicate the process even further. There's also different kinds of motion inputs you need to know. You have your standard quarter circles and your DPs, but you can also have charge inputs where you hold a direction for a bit and then press another direction, and then the button to do the move. And even 360 motions where you do a full circle and you press the button as the stick goes up. There's many more that you can use to scare Smash players, but that's not entirely relevant to the discussion right now. These unique inputs lead to an interesting microgame, as players have to physically control their characters in unique ways to make sure their execution is up to snuff as they attempt to pull off special moves and flashy combos. However, where the games really shine is when you begin to ignore the microgame and look more at the macro game. Every character in a fighting game can be seen as a tool that brings specific things that they can do to the table. Some characters are like Swiss Army knives, having every tool for every job, but most of the time you'd rather just be using a different tool. Whereas some characters are more like a high quality tool, very good at one thing, but they can only do that one thing. The macro of these games comes from how these characters interact with each other and figuring out where you want your character to be on the screen and what you want them to be doing, how to get to that position, while denying the opponent's character from getting where they want to be and doing what they want to do. There's also characters that require a lot of micro skill, and how good the player is can affect their macro. For example, Baiken in Strive can do an instant overhead, but she needs to do a tricky input in order to perform it while on the ground. If a player can do this, it may affect their macro plan, as they now have a way to break the enemy's guard. However, if they can't, then they wouldn't be able to explore that aspect of the macro game, as the option simply isn't available to them. These games also have very little when it comes to luck factor. A lot of competitive games add some form of luck in order to keep players on their toes or punish players for not playing the game correctly, but fighting games are basically always consistent, unless you're playing one of these guys. And finally, fighting games are anime. Like, anime is everywhere. So, why are fighting games considered hard? Well, when you lose in a modern competitive game, there's generally something to soften the blow. For example, if you lose in a battle royale, you get told what place you gained to try and make yourself feel better. Or the game gives you consolation prizes like XP for a battle pass, making it sting a little bit less. Or maybe there's teammates that you can push the blame onto when you lose, so you don't have to think about it too much. In fighting games, when you lose, your character gets their ass beat for 60 seconds and the game spells out in massive fuck off letters, you lose, and you get nothing for it. And it feels like shit. In fighting games, if someone is better than you, even just by a little bit, it's very easy for matches to become extremely one-sided and feel like there was nothing you could have done in order to win. When you lose, you feel it, and there's nothing else you can do apart from accept that they were better than you. Well, not nothing. A lot of people go to the game balanced, but there's always that lingering feeling that you lost and it was your own fault. There's also the problem that when you get good at these games, it's pretty hard to go easy on a new player. Players have the option to play different characters, but there's some fundamental skills to the game that newer players won't know, and better players just won't even really be thinking about. I remember trying to get one of my friends into Strive, and I would bounce all over the character select trying to find a way for them to make the matches easier for them, and the only way I could was basically by putting my controller down. It kind of sucked. Not to mention, these games generally have a sink or swim way of teaching the player. Tekken 7 has no way for players to learn basically anything about the game, and it doesn't do shit to explain itself. And Street Fighter 5 basically doesn't try. There are ways to learn these games out there, but players have to go and seek them out if they want to be taught anything about these games, and no one wants to do homework before they start playing a video game. And finally, the games have no real casual modes to ease players into the game. If we look at competitive games, there's generally some modes that players can play that don't have anything to do with the competitive aspect of the game. CSGO has gun games, team deathmatches, community servers, and entire single and co-op campaigns for players to play through. Rocket League has a bunch of different courses that change up the rules of the game for people to play for fun. They also subtly teach you some more advanced mechanics. MOBAs like League of Legends have rotating game modes that give players new ways to play their games with their friends, and they have wacky rules that remove the competitiveness from the matches. Fighting games, as of currently, don't really have this, so new players have to decide that they want to get into the genre for no other reason than they think it looks cool. But does any of this make these games hard to play? No, not really. There's definitely a barrier of entry when it comes to learning how to play fighting games competitively, and there's going to be a level of work that you need to put in if you want to get better at these games, but that can be said about literally every other competitive thing in the world. If you want to get into Counter-Strike, you need to know what guns are good and what to avoid, what the callouts on each map are, what good smokes to throw down, what angles are good to hold, which areas are good places to just get shot. In Hearthstone, you need to know what decks are meta, what counters the meta decks, what cards synergize with what cards are good and which are dog shit, what the goal of your deck is, what a good opening hand looks like and what a shitty one looks like, and what you should do if your opponent immediately counters it. Don't even get me started on MOBAs, dude. Jesus Christ, they all have so much to learn in them. And it's not like these games go easy on you either. Have you ever played against a good Counter-Strike player? Do you think waiting for 60 seconds for a match to be over feels like shit? Buddy, try waiting 60 seconds every round because some dude blew your brains out all over the walls because you just went out of spawn a bit too slowly. So, why are people more willing to give other genres a shot and learn more advanced techniques to get better and not even try to learn the basic bread and butter combos in fighting games? Well, it's not because they're harder, it's because they're not as inviting. In most other competitive games, you can play with a group of friends and you all leap into the unknown and learn together. It's much easier to ask the boys to play a couple of rounds of Fall Guys on a work night than it is asking them if you want to kick their ass at Street Fighter. Playing against your friends is fun, but most people will want to play with their friends to beat a common goal instead of just against each other. And with games that focus more on the 1v1 aspects, you tend to find that these games rely much more on the macro game, focuses less on micro interactions, so players don't have to worry about dropping inputs and such. Combining this with poor teaching tools, fighting games have had a hard time gripping players at the start, and they're not able to provide an experience where players are eased into the competitive aspects of the game. They just drop straight into it without any warning. And for most players, that feels like crap, so they'll go play what their friends are playing and slowly learn those games instead. So, what can fighting games do? Well, it looks like some games have already gone down the right path. The next Street Fighter game, Street Fighter 6, seems to have an entire single-player open-world mode, where it will hopefully teach players the basics of fighting games so they're able to learn these games in a safe environment before being dropped into the pool. Hello, this is Editing Gecko Squirrel. I'm not actually on script right now, but there's some things that I want to elaborate on with the Street Fighter 6 news. So recently Capcom did like a massive info dump on a bunch of Street Fighter 6 stuff, and they showed not only like the intro start of the single player campaign, which looks really good, but they showed that they actually have like dedicated casual modes of just like dumb stuff that you can do with your friends. Like there's one where it'll have stage hazards, like a bull runs across the screen There's like balls that you can hit and they'll explode, basically like Faust bombs. There's like a knockdown version where it doesn't matter how much damage you do, all you gotta do is get a knockdown on your opponent. There's like a beat 'em up mode. It looks like really good. It's sort of more of the things that you'd want to see for like casual players to try and get them into the game, because there's just more stuff to do that doesn't involve fighting your friends or fighting other people. So I genuinely think Street Fighter 6 is going to be a very good case example of the kind of stuff that fighting games need to do more. Just seeing Capcom take that direction and take that step is really good, and I think we should all keep an eye out on this game because, you know, there's a good chance it'll blow up because of it. Also, custom characters are always just kind of a plus. They're always just kind of a win. You can just make whatever you want. It looks really in-depth as well. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Back to the end of the video. Thank you all for watching. This video was brought to you in part by my wonderful patrons over at patreon.com/GeckoSquirrel, as well as my viewers on Twitch. If you want to come drop by and say hi, I'll be playing Stride with my viewers, so we might be able to catch some games in if you want. Thank you all for watching, and go play some fighting games. They're fun, I swear. Thank you to Super, Brodekai, Lady Dantalon, Monact, Mystery, Proxicon, Daniel Wiedericht, Rabbitmask, Tom Tanks, Edison Luddery, Smeech, Strawfox, and Otaku Joseph for being tier 2 Patreon subs. Learn more about how you can join this list in the description.